Welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Roseman, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this first session in this historic conference. We have three speakers on the panel. Professor Tarquini will give the first paper, and she'll talk for about 40 minutes. And then our professors Rabinbach and Forlin will each speak for about 20 minutes. So I'm hoping that if we all stick to time, we'll have about 3/4 of an hour for discussion, but I'm under strict instructions to finish the panel at 12 so that you don't miss lunch, so you don't miss the bus, so you don't miss this afternoon's session. So I will begin. So our first speaker is Professor Alessandra Tarquini, who, as you already know, is a professor of contemporary history here at Sapienza. She's the author of many books and essays on the fascist regime, on intellectual history, and on antisemitism, including Storia della cultura fascista, Italian intellectuals and international politics, Sinistra italiana e gli ebrei, socialismo, zionismo e antisemitismo dal 1892 al 1992, and A History of Italian Fascist Culture. She is the scientific coordinator of the Permanent Seminar on Contemporary History at the Department of Social and Economic Sciences here at Sapienza. And in 2021, she edited The European Left and the Jewish Question Between Zionism and Antisemitism. Please.
Thank you. You have a very good accent. Thank you. As is well known, since the end of the Second World War, most historians thought that fascism and culture were incompatible terms. And they negated the existence of fascist culture and fascist ideology. So they considered fascism, I'd say, as a practical phenomenon, pointed to the fact that the regime didn't produce its own political doctrine comparable of those of great political traditions as liberalism, socialism, communism. Contrary to this interpretation, from the early 1960s on, and the Stanford Conference is a very important moment of this trend, European and American scholars of diverse training and ideological positions argued not only the existence of the fascist ideology, but that its understanding was essential to any wholesale understanding of the regime. So they studied the intellectual origins, characteristic of fascism, and in this sense, for us today, studying the fascist ideology means, on the one hand, seeking out and gathering primary sources, but on the other hand, always taking into account the significant contributions of these authors, and I think recognizing that our work is rooted in a long-standing tradition. So I'd say that we are not alone. I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. So in my talk, I'll try to describe, to analyze the fascist ideology, focusing on the myth of the state and its major theorist, Giovanni Gentile. In the second part, I will dwell on the differences between fascism and nationalism. And in the final part, I will present some conclusions. So, in 1976, so many years ago, Ze'ev observed that the history of political doctrines is marked by disagreement about the semantic value of terms. For example, he noted that the term democracy has provoked wide and interminable debates about its meaning, its scope in the word, its ability to be concretized as political praxis. Nevertheless, no one denies the existence of democratic thought because of the difficulty of reaching its goals. In the case of fascism, on the other hand, commentators, journalists, historians, sociologists have pointed to programmatic and intellectual inconsistency, contradictoriness, and the contrast between declared scope and achieved results as major feature of its political culture. And I think that it is a very important consideration. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the idea that in every political movement, one may encounter a certain degree of dissonance between ideology and action. As the major contributions on the ideology of fascism show, it could not be understood as a translation of a conceptual model, and therefore it could not be analyzed as if it were a political theory. So a rigidly conceptual definition of ideology, fascist ideology, cannot explain a political phenomenon like fascism, which critique all forms of rationalism and proclaimed the power of myth to organize the masses, introducing a new way of doing politics. So from the beginning, fascists espoused a notion of politics no longer or not only aimed at changing the world, but rather at experiencing life. That is to say, I mean, a notion of politics as a religious faith. It was a new synthesis of political thought born out of the national radicalism developed at the beginning of the century and sustained by the Great War's new mythologies, a new ideology which refuted the primacy of reason in history and traditional categories of political thought, and which understood politics as a totalizing force by which man could transform himself. And as I try to stress, to point out in my book, History of Fascist Culture, from 1922 to 1943, the ideology of the regime was the expression of political myth. And summarized in a very broad theme, I would say that the most important among them was the myth of the state, as I'll try to show here. I believe that better than other expressions of the history of fascism, this ideology shows the correctness of Emilio Gentile's analysis about totalitarianism. According to him, as is well known, totalitarianism is an experiment in political domination undertaken by a revolutionary movement with an integralist conception of politics that aspires toward a monopoly of power and that after having secured power, destroys or transforms the previous regime and constructs a new state based on a single-party regime with the objective to concur in society. Gentile argued that totalitarianism is always imperfect. It is an experiment, a continuous experiment, a process, a dynamic process aimed at institutionalizing the principle of permanent revolution. For a scholar of political culture and intellectuals, a history of intellectuals, as I am, this definition is very important, extremely important, and commands the attention for two main reasons. First of all, because he claims that one of the totalitarian regime's characteristics is the primacy of politics. Primacy of politics above all other factors of individual and social life. So totalitarianism is a political regime and not an idea. A regime that aspires to control, manipulate, change people's life, practically building a new world and a new man. It's not a simple statement, okay? Fascists sanctioned the primacy of politics, for example, deciding who is in and who is out of community, or for example, physically eliminated those who could never become new fascists, Jews and anti-fascists. So I'd like to stress this concept because I think that this is the main difference between fascism and, for example, the new right-wing political parties in Europe and USA. I'm sure we will have the possibility, the chance to talk about it in the coming days. But there is another reason why I think that Emilio Gentile's affirmation is important, because he directly faces the problem of modernity in fascism. And I totally agree with him, and before him, with many intellectuals that in the 30s and in the following years underlined the modernity of fascism. And I totally agree with those which maintain that the key feature of modernity is the transfer of the sacred from the sphere of religion to that of politics, and that fascism as modern revolutionary political phenomenon and totalitarian experiment was a political religion, as the myth of the state shows. since it came to power, fascism presented itself as a movement that would restore the authority of the state. In 1925, Mussolini asserted everything, I quote, everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. 1925. So summarized the fascist ideological central core, which would be developed in the following years by philosophers, jurists, historians. So between 1922 and 1943, fascists worked to create a new state in which the masses would be organized and every aspect of Italian social life lose its autonomy, and every institution became an articulation of the new state, subordinated to its general ends. And negating the existence of individual and collective rights that could limit the state's power, the fascists saw themselves as the founders of a new civilization. And in this sense, the most important theorist of this conception was the philosopher Giovanni Gentile. Giovanni Gentile became Minister of Public Education in October 1922, when he was already one of the most authoritative Italian philosophers, and joined the fascist party in May 1923. So he was a real fascist. He thought that fascism would complete the process begun with the Risorgimento to build a new state and give Italians a new sense of identity. In addition to leading several cultural institutions, he composed various ideological pieces. In 1932, he published the entry Fascist Doctrine for volume 14 of the Enciclopedia Italiana. This entry was a true manifesto of the regime's ideology, consisted of two parts. The first was written by the philosopher and entitled Foundational Ideas. The second was compiled by Benito Mussolini and entitled Political and Social Doctrine. In the first section, Gentile argued, I quote, "The cornerstone of fascist doctrine is the concept of the state, of its essence, of its role, its finality. For fascism, the state is an absolute which renders individuals and groups relative." So individuals and groups are only thinkable within the state. So this state would know no limits and would express its power without restricting itself to the simple tasks of maintaining order, as happened in liberal regimes. He would be an, I quote, interior form and norm. As Gentile himself declared, it was the nucleus of an absolute religious notion of politics. I quote Gentile, "Fascism is a religious idea in which man is seen and his immanent relationship to a superior law with an objective will that transcends the specific individual and elevates him to conscious member of a spiritual society. Those who, when considering the fascist regime's religious politics, stop at considering the opportunities it presents, have failed to understand that fascism, more than just a system of government, is also and first and foremost a system of thought, of religion." So for Giovanni Gentile, fascist politics represented a faith, a mission, a constant existential mission, and a spiritual communion that would transform consciousness, providing Italians a sense of identity. A few years later, in 1937, he reconfirmed these ideas in a philosophical text for the third edition of his Foundation of the Philosophy of Law, I fondamenti della filosofia del diritto. Gentile added two new chapters, one about the state and another one about politics. In the first, he examined Hegel's political thought, praising it for demonstrating the limits of contractualism and understanding that the state is a self-consciously ethical entity. That is a moral phenomenon and not a tool for attaining individual aims. Having gained this ground, it was necessary to go beyond, to view the state an expression of a collective will. The state, he argued, is not inter homines, that is not the result of an agreement among citizens or a product of rational choice. The state is in interiore homine, as the fruit of the individual will and therefore the highest achievement of its freedom. Freedom is possible only within the state. Gentile, but this applies to many other ideologies of fascism less famous than him, Carlo Costamagna, Sergio Panunzio, Ugo Spirito, and Alfredo Rocco, the most important jurist of fascism, agreed in claiming that the political doctrine they supported was founded on the myth of the state. Of course, they were different, coming from different backgrounds, experiences, political experiences, but they claimed that fascist state would be impeded by nothing, neither individual nor group nor institution, nothing could compromise its power. So in Gentile's eyes, it was a new Italian civilization founded on a radical transformation of consciousness, on the individual ability to feel like a part of the state. These thinkers, Gentile, Costamagna, Panunzio, blah, blah, these thinkers supported an idea, an experience of politics understood not only in traditional terms as a project undertaken to transform daily life, but rather as a faith. And I think that this explains why they never questioned their devotion to fascism. Confident that they were participating in building a new civilization. And we can say that the fascist regime is not a monolith, no? But its main intellectuals shared these beliefs, summoned by the regime to lend their talents, proud of being intellectuals in the service of politics. They fought like other intellectuals to assert their position as theorists of the fascist state. And in my opinion, it is in this sense that fascist ideology was an ideology based on the myth of the state and not a simple form of nationalism. We have here, dov'è Donatello? Donatello, dov'è? He's the real expert in Italian nationalism, so now I'm trying to talk about the relationship between fascism and nationalism. This relationship is one of the most examined topics taken up by those who study fascist ideology. I'd say that some scholars have argued that fascism is a variant of nationalism, while others have emphasized the differences between fascist and nationalist ideologies and politics. Especially after the 1929 Lateran Treaty, according to the first group, the regime shifted toward a reactionary and conservative position in line with the Catholic Church. For instance, Luisa Mangoni, Franco Gaeta, Gabriele Turi highlighted the centrality of nationalism and Catholicism in the fascist dictatorship's cultural politics. Gabriele Turi, for example, wrote that Gentile and Rocco were both the most significant proponents of a moderate nationalism, conservative fascism, derived from nationalism, which arose from the ruling class desire to play a role in building the new state. Other scholars, and I agree with them, have argued that nationalism was merely one of the several political movements that converged into fascism, and certainly not the most important. For example, Renzo De Felice thought that Gentile, Giovanni, not Emilio, had a decisive influence on fascist culture and above all on Mussolini, who allowed him to compose the first part of the Doctrine of Fascism, entry for the Enciclopedia Italiana. For De Felice, while the nationalists were fascist sympathizers among the old ruling class, Giovanni Gentile was the theorist of a new revolutionary culture welcomed with open arms by Mussolini and the fascists. In keeping with De Felice's arguments, some scholars stressed that nationalism had not constituted the ideological heart of the fascist regime. It was simply one of many political trends whose influence on early fascism was no more than of other movements like futurism, idealism, revolutionary syndicalism. For example, in his pioneering study on Alfredo Rocco, Paolo Ungari warned against understanding nationalism as the intellectual roots of 20th century totalitarian revolutions. And Emilio Gentile also believes that the nationalism was only one of the cultural and political trends that merged into fascism. In more recent years, the question has returned to the attention of scholars. Many authoritative European and American historians, and here we have some of them, have argued for the importance of analysis going beyond the national boundaries to study the mutual influences, the transmission of ideas, and the circulation of practices, comparing illiberal movements, political parties, and regimes. So we can say that their aim is to show the existence of a network of cultural and political relationships in 1920s and 1930s, stressing the existence of a mixture of different culture and practices. Some scholars maintain that after the Great War, the old conservative political views intertwined with those of a new radical right in a process of mutual influence, and I think that is true. In different countries, the fascist right would lose its subversive force, while the old nationalist and conservative right would become more radical and pro-fascist. But as Donatello Aramini wrote in his latest book, it is a way to read the crisis of democracies in Europe after the First World War. And it's a way, identifying the nationalism with fascism. In fact, these historians support that there is no autonomous and original fascist ideology, or at least they tend to downplay the difference between nationalism of the early century and fascism, because the nationalists strongly adhered to fascism, and on the other hand, fascists were never a revolutionary movement or party, but remained linked to old political practices. I'm not sure that is true, because I think that it is not true. And although the relationship between nationalist and fascist movements, between the old right and the new one, have been characterized by reciprocal exchanges, I think that fascist sources show a different reality. In Italy, in the 1930s, there was an authentic displacement between the concept of the state and that of the nation in political and cultural values, as is evident in some important official documents. If in the early years the fascist party had presented itself as nation aspiring to become a new state, in the following years, and even more beginning in the 1930s, fascist state proclaimed itself the creator of the nation. For example, while in the statue, the fascist party statue in 1921 and in 1926, the fascist party was described as a militia serving the nation. In 1929, this reference was removed, and in 1932, it was changed with a militia serving the state. So we know that it was Mussolini himself who replaced the expression fascist nation with the fascist state. From this point of view, the fascists expressed a political conception analogous to that articulated by Giovanni Gentile in the entry Dottrina del Fascismo, refusing any naturalistic and deterministic conception of the nation. What's the difference? What's the difference between state and nation? Fascists thought that nationalism was something old, belonging to a different civilization and culture, overtaken by the new fascist era. We could say that, according to them, nation is a static concept, a fact, something done, completed, while the state is a dynamic concept that expresses the force and the primacy of politics, the will to create a new world. And while the nationalists, with their naturalistic and materialistic concept of politics, believed that the nation had created the state, fascist intellectuals observed that with fascism, the country made itself into the state. As Camillo Pellizzi, one fascist intellectual, in 1926 argued, no concept of an Italian nation exists. The fascist state not only rules the nation, but absorbs and eliminates it. Yeah. 24. Okay. These considerations were shared by the Fascist Party's Dictionary of Politics, an official publication, a dictionary, published in 1940. It was a political and ideological work expressing clearly the fascist conception of politics. Unlike the Enciclopedia Italiana, the dictionary, the dizionario, was to be a manifestation of politics in action. The entry nation was written by jurist Carlo Costamagna. Carlo Costamagna was a jurist, a political scientist, the director of the magazine Lo Stato, the state, one of the prominent figures of fascism. He portrayed the nation's absolute subordination to the state. So yet again, fascists emphasized the static, not nationalist nature of their political ideology. And Costamagna wrote, it is a mistaken logic to create a contrast or just to separate the problem of nationality from that of the state. Nationality before the state is the starting point of a process that gains historical value only based on how it ends within the state. So for Costamagna, the idea of the state was the quintessence of politics. Okay. In conclusion, as we have just seen, from 1922 to 1943, fascist regime developed its specific ideology. Authoritative intellectuals, such as jurists, philosophers, political scientists, and scholars contributed to this doctrine. To summarize it, we can recall the sentence uttered by Mussolini in 1925. Everything is in the state, nothing is against the state, nothing is outside of the state. It was not just a matter of affirming an absolute power, but to imagine an anthropological revolution that would lead to a new civilization. The state realized, affirmed the primacy of politics over any other sort of manifestation of the human experience, with the aim of creating a new fascist man that would work towards the goals of the regime. And I think that primary fascist sources demonstrate this. I mean, together with the works of the author, who have contributed most to our understanding of the phenomenon. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, in this paper, for a long time, historians denied the existence of an autonomous an original ideology, and since the second half of the 1960s, their reflections have changed, and in recent decades have become far richer and more articulate than they once were. This is not to say that now we have, there is agreement among scholars on this subject, as Roger Griffin has argued. Griffin maintained that the debate had gone through a period of consolidation and convergence, as most scholars are now willing to accept that fascism was a political revolutionary phenomenon. In fact, I don't agree with him, because in fact, even today, many authors deny autonomy of thought to fascism, considering nationalism and fascism as similar aspects of a single phenomenon, that of the crisis of liberal democracy after the First World War. As I have already argued, this doesn't seem to me entirely convincing. It is true that fascism influenced the European right-wingers, and it is true that European nationalists absorbed fascist political culture, just as it is true that fascism took in some elements of nationalist political culture. On the other hand, talking about mixture, hybridization, about political cultures and ideology doesn't help to understand the specifics of different phenomena. I mean, ideologies are always the result of hybridization, mixture, relationships, of a network of relationships. So there is no such thing as a pure ideology, because ideologies are not political theories. They are, we could say, they are action-oriented worldviews, as Karl Mannheim in 1929 wrote in Ideology and Utopia. Mannheim wrote, "Such a system of meanings is possible and valid only in a given type of historical existence, to which, for a time, it furnishes appropriate expression. When the social and political situation changes, the system of norms to which it had previously given birth ceases to be in harmony with it." So we could say that history, as Mark Bloch wrote many years ago, is the science of change and difference. And, you know, I started to study fascism many years ago to try to answer a question. And I think it's very important to have to clear our question research. My question was, and is, why did we become fascist? Why did Italian intellectuals become fascist? And what is the specificity of fascism? And I mean, I believe this is a way to take seriously into account the violence of power and to recognize that fascism invented a political religion based on the myth of the state, a violent, imperialistic, racist state. And as I tried to write in the book, and here today in this paper, this was my main question. Of course, it's only a perspective, and I think, but I'm sure that our discussion will be fruitful for me, for you, and for those who are listening to us. Thank you.